This is Skin Lecture 2. We're going to be looking at some details of the dermis during these slides. The dermis is quite different than the epidermis. It's a deeper, thicker layer. And when you look at the dermis, we don't see stacked cells. Instead, we're going to see some cells with nuclei, and they're going to be surrounded by ECF, which contains some protein fibers. If you look at the diagram, the arrow points to a layer that is dark pink. And this is the first time you're seeing the basal layer not in a straight line. In some parts of the body, the basal layer goes up and down, kind of like hills and valleys. What these two kinds of protein fibers does is very important. The fibers are collagen and elastin. Collagen prevents overstretching. Think of a pregnant woman whose skin stretches quite a bit, but goes back into place. That's because she has healthy collagen in the skin, and it does change over the aging process. Also, collagen can be damaged by UV light. So in addition to UV light causing cancer, UV light causes the skin to age by damaging collagen. Elastin keeps tension in the skin. It's very related to collagen. Elastin is responsible for another feature in the dermis. In the top layer of the dermis, as I showed you on that last diagram, we have these hills and valleys, and those are actually called dermal papilla. Another term for them are dermal ridges. Because these ridges occur in the dermis in certain parts of the body, on the epidermis we see the feature that we call fingerprints. In this diagram, again, now the arrow is pointing to the light pink. We are in the dermis. We are in the very top part of the dermis, and you can see one of these areas that goes up and down. That would be a dermal ridge or dermal papilla. Here's an interesting question. How do we know that the fingerprints or the dermal papilla are actually in the dermis and not the epidermis? The answer to that is a person can damage their epidermis pretty bad and it heals, and their fingerprint is the same pattern as before. Some criminals have tried to change their fingerprint pattern. It's very difficult unless you really do extensive, deep damage. Here's a diagram that illustrates elastin. Think of elastin as making the dermis push up from underneath to support the epidermis. In this diagram, the epidermis is the area above the notched area. The notched area represents the basal layer. Look at the area where there's a wrinkle. The wrinkle is basically an indentation in the epidermis, and picture that the dermis beneath that wrinkle is not pushing upward against the wrinkle, and so the wrinkle, gravity pulls on the wrinkle. Gravity allows the wrinkle to occur because there's nothing counteracting it underneath. A fold would be even more of this, where there's less dermis that has firmness underneath the fold, so the epidermis can indent in. There's two other accessory structures. Recall, accessory structures are things that are in the dermis that are not really part of the skin, but they exist in the area. We're going to look at blood vessels and nerves. Look at the diagram, and there's a fine red and blue line that extends quite high up into the dermis, towards the outside, almost to the dermal ridges. These are tiny, tiny blood vessels. If you follow them down deeper, you see that they lead into a bigger diameter artery or vein. So basically, the way your blood is set up, the deeper into the dermis you go, the larger the blood vessel. We wouldn't want large blood vessels close to the dermal ridges because then if you cut yourself, had a minor cut, you could bleed quite a bit. But keep in mind, every skin cell needs oxygen and glucose delivered, so you have to have some blood vessels into all parts of the dermis. Here's a question to think about. Say you cut your finger and it bleeds. What layer was injured? The answer is the dermis, or even lower, depending on how much bleeding. So it is possible to cut into the epidermis, have no blood, and that just means you haven't reached any small blood vessel yet. The other accessory structure is nerves and nerve receptors. In this diagram, you'll see that you have a nerve, and then branching from the nerve are receptors. The nerve would go to the spinal cord and eventually the brain, possibly. And the receptors are pictured as oval structures in the dermis. You have heat receptors to detect the temperature. You have light touch receptors. By light, we do not mean sunlight. We mean a light touch. If somebody brushes up against you, your skin has receptors, and that's how you get a sensation that you felt something. You have pain receptors, cold receptors. Now look at where it says hair and go down deep. At the base of the hair follicle, we haven't covered hair yet, but down towards the bottom, there are receptors that detect hair movement. Let's say you go outside, some wind blows on your hair, you get a sensation of that. That's because the hair has moved and it has triggered the receptors at the base. Finally, look at the strong pressure receptors. They're deeper. For somebody to detect that something has pushed against their body and it's more force, you have to trigger receptors that are down deeper. So that's a little summary of how the skin gets some sensation and starts some nerve messages. In aging, as you age, your epidermis and dermis are thinner. That's because you have less mitosis going on. Also, the dermis does not make collagen and elastin so much through the aging process. The other thing that you may notice, pigment spots. After years and years of UV exposure, you can have permanent pigment spots that don't just appear in the summer or when you're exposed to UV light. They are permanent. Finally, we're going to be looking ahead at more accessory structures. Next video, we're going to look at glands and hair, and then we'll go down under the dermis to the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer, which is not actually skin. So this is the end of Skin Lecture 3.